This is a demo using acrylic paint, and I just want to give people an idea of how I would instruct. So for my classes, I would start off with some supplies, the basic needs. When you're working from home, there's a link to a shopping list that I've created on dickblick.com for you. But if you have any of those supplies already, just don't add them to your cart. Just add the ones that you need. So for example, I've got a palette knife here just for mixing the paint. I've got a bigger brush. This is fairly inexpensive. This is cheap brand. And it's a little bit softer for big washes. I've got a medium-sized filbert, which is a brush that's kind of flat on one side so I can get a thin edge or a thick edge, but then it's rounded on the end. And then the smaller brush for any detail work that might need to go in. I've also got my paints here and a palette to work on, plus water. So I'm using a paper palette, a bucket of water, and then my paint, I'm using the M.Graham Acrylics. I really like them, but you could use any acrylics that you have. I just recommend trying to use the best quality paint you can. Otherwise, you hamstring yourself a little bit. It can be difficult to create opacity, like layer over top of another color without being see-through. Sometimes you have to have the higher quality paint to be able to do that. Otherwise, a lot of them, even if they are normally a color you would associate with being opaque, they can still be see-through. So I've got titanium white, I've got cadmium yellow light, I've got Quinacridone Rose, burnt umber, and ultramarine blue. And for me, these 5 colors are my basic standard limited palette, and almost anything I paint I can do with these. Not everything, but almost anything. The only exception might be if I have a color like turquoise, then I'll add the turquoise to my palette. Some other colors that can be difficult to mix at times might be some oranges or some purples. So switching out your red can make a difference there, switching out your blue. But for now, this is a good, solid beginner's palette. I've added turquoise to my palette here for this painting because I'm going to do this picture of a pear. Just something nice and simple to give you an idea of how we'd go along. Our demos would happen this way, where I'd talk a little bit and I'd actually start painting, showing you how to load your brush, just some really basic color mixing ideas. But I encourage all my students to take a color theory class to really learn about color. After I'm done with my demo, then I'd go into the live Zoom session for folks who wanted one-on-one advice about their paintings. And you can just use your cell phone to take a picture of your painting in progress, email it to me, and then I'll be able to bring it up on screen and share it with you and talk about your painting while everybody else is working on theirs. I'll be able to tell you where you're going to change things, where you can add a color or add a different value, how dark or light, help you out with ways to layer the paint, and that's how I would work with my class. So I'm just going to begin. I've laid out some color here. I've got my titanium white, my cadmium yellow light, my Quinacridone Rose. I am using turquoise instead of ultramarine blue here because there is turquoise in this painting, and I felt like it was blue enough that I could get away without using my ultramarine blue, and my burnt umber. And I'm just going to start with my smaller detail brush and some paint with a little bit of water mixed in to draw out my painting. So I'm just going to go into my water and just add a few dots of water here. And I'm just going to use some of that Quin Rose with some water. So in that watery paint, my first layer of paint will always be a slightly more watery paint. And I'm looking for just general basic shapes when I first do my drawing. So what I see in this pear is a bit of a circle shape. So I hover over first and then plop it down there. And then above it, a bit of an oval kind of popping up. A bit of a shape like this. So something along those lines. I'm not worried about perfection. I just want to get the general shape. Now I'm also going to draw in just the basic shape of the stem. And I don't have to draw in all the detail, just to get the general idea of where that stem is going to go. And maybe also this ground here. Now I have a trick for creating a ground that's relatively straight. I use my pinky. So if I have my pinky here attached to the bottom of my canvas, and I just hold it and figure out where my line is going to go. Notice how my whole arm is moving, and I'm able to create a straighter line. So I'm just going to decide my ground is going to go somewhere like here. I can go right through that pear if I need to, because I'm just going to be painting over all that anyway. That's pretty much all I need to do. The last little step that I think is one of the most important and underappreciated steps is to draw out some of the shadows as well. So I'm just going to draw where I see the shadow, and it kind of fades off. So I'll just like let it go after that. Clean off my brush after every use by tapping it on the bottom of the cup. And I always like to have some blue towels. I like these shop towels. You might just use a paper towel or a rag to clean off my brush and put it aside. So I'm always cleaning off my brush in between each step and wiping the brush off. And the way I do that is I tap on the bottom of that cup, bring it to the paper towel, and then just kind of squeeze. The brush doesn't need to be perfectly clean, but clean enough that I don't have to worry about it anymore. Now I'm going to go to my background, just start laying in some color. This is called color blocking. So I'm just going to go get my brush a little bit damp. And I see that that color in that background is a bit of an orangey brown. So I'm going to take my brown, I'm going to add some yellow and some red, because yellow and red make orange. You can hold it up and see how close I am. If I need to lighten it, I add a little bit of white. And anytime I add white, I add a little bit more yellow to that color as well. And there we're getting a little bit closer. But if I put it over here, notice how dark it is. So just holding my brush up alone shows me how dark or how light my color needs to be. I need to darken it up for that shadow area. I'm going to add more of my brown back into my color and hold it up. Notice how the color starts to disappear more when I squint my eyes. If you squint your eyes, or even as you're looking at it, that brush should disappear a little bit more. That means that color and value are fairly close. Doesn't have to be perfect. So again, I'm just going to lay this in, and the water can be added to the paint to help it flow more smoothly at this step. And I'm not worried about perfection. I just want to lay this color in. Now, here's the downside of mixing your color with a brush. Notice how I have to keep going in and adding that color to my mix again. I have to keep mixing it on the fly because I don't have enough. So this is where that palette knife can be really handy. I'm just going to paint right over that stem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my palette knife instead. If I go and use that bottom edge to grab some yellow, grab a little bit of red and some white, and then mix it in with my brown, I'll get a bigger mix. And then I just corral the color into a little blob as much as possible. I'm going to lighten that color up again, trying to get somewhere closer to what that value is. We're getting pretty close there. Again, same thing with my palette knife. I've got to clean it off after every use. That's probably the biggest thing I see students kind of skipping that step, and it's important. You want to be able to use that palette knife in the future, so you want to keep it clean in between steps. Now I can go back in and again darken up this corner if need be. I can add layers really easily, and that's the nice thing about acrylic paint. So I can just go in. If I need to darken up my my brown, I can just add a little touch of blue to my brown to help darken up that color for that very top corner. And again, I'm not worried about perfection. If my brush strokes show, well, good. This is a painting, not a perfect photo. It's just a representation of this pear. Now, to make my life easier, I'm just going to go back in and just make sure I get my values right off the get-go. Values are darks and lights. Again, I'm mixing here on the fly, you guys, with my brush. This isn't the best way to mix, but I just want to make this quicker so you don't have to sit here and watch paint dry. So I'm just going to lighten all this area here around my pear because my pear, notice, is darker than the background. So I need to make sure my background is light enough that I don't have to get black with the pear. The pear doesn't have to get too dark. Okay, I'm going to put in that ground now. I'm going to clean off that brush by tapping on the bottom of that cup, wiping it off with my paper towel. If I need to, I can clean off my palette a little bit so I have a new place to work. Oops. Just dip my paper towel in water and wipe off my paper palette so I have more space. And now I'm going to do the Turquoise Ground. Turquoise itself, just a color out of the tube by M.Graham, is quite a dark value. So I can even use it on its own for the darkest area of the shadow. But then I'm going to get lighter into my more highlighted lighter areas. If I use another layer here and get really thick, then the color gets really dark. Anywhere I need to lighten up the color, I can add just a touch of white if I want, but really that color has a tiny little bit of green in it too. Don't stress out about this part of it. Just, you know, the big thing is we're just learning how to use the paint, how to apply it to the canvas. And my class will really be about very beginner concepts, how to add the paint to your brush, and then how to paint it onto the canvas or paper or panel, whatever it is you decide to work with. So I'm just taking my lighter turquoise. Now I'm going to add some more blue. Just get a little bit darker into this left edge as the things get a little darker as they go off into the distance here. And the shadow just kind of disappears into it. I'm actually working on a panel right now that I primed myself, primed with a clear gesso. Gesso is G-E-S-S-O. And most of the canvases and panels you buy, if they're white, they've already been gessoed. But I like to gesso it myself, so you might be able to see some of that texture underneath of here, what looks like a painting under the painting. Okay, so I'm going to start painting my pear again, just really simple. Simple colors, simple shapes. I'm just going to go into my dark turquoise and add some red here. Maybe a little bit of brown. Just get a dark purple color that I can use in my shadow. And just start my pear with that shadow color. So I'm starting with my dark colors. Anybody who's ever worked with watercolor before, this is the exact opposite way of working. With watercolor, you start with your white of the paper and then your lighter values and slowly get darker. But here I'm working with my darker values and I'm going to start getting lighter little by little. I'm going to add some more red, wipe off my brush a little bit because it's got so much dark on it. Add some more of my red to this color, a little bit of the brown because there is brown in that background. And just start putting in some of these lighter shadows here. They all connect. I'm just, when I see it get a little bit lighter, I'm painting it a little bit lighter. For a beginner class like Discovery Oils and Discovery Acrylics, I always send around a little bit of a colored cheat sheet showing students how they can use their paint to make certain colors that I might see in an area. Okay, so now this red, when I add white to it, look what happens. It gets really pink, kind of magenta-y, and that's not what I'm seeing there. So when I go to a lighter value, I've really got to consider the color that makes when I add white. I might even just need to use solid red. If I look at the solid red, well, that's pretty much what I'm seeing. So I'm just gonna, for my highlighted area here, where I don't have the bright whites yet, I'm just gonna paint in my solid red. And notice we're getting a little bit of a line between where my shadow is and where this red is, because this red is what we call transparent. It's a little see-through. I'm not gonna worry too much about that right now. What I can do is go back into some of my dark and go in between these two lines and just kind of create some marks to kind of blur that line a little bit, make it look blurry. But notice how I've still gone in and just kind of made it a little bit messy. It's not like it's a perfect shading where it goes smoothly from one color to the other. With acrylic paint, put that out of your mind. Don't stress out about that too much. Allow it to be a little bit chunky, a little imperfect, and I will show you how we can make it look a little smoother later once this is all dry. So right now I'm still just going in and checking to see where I have my darkest darks and adding them in to make sure I've got dark enough areas in here. Putting a little more turquoise in that bottom area if I need to darken it up. And what I want to do is I just want to add some yellow to my red. Just a little bit, mostly red, a little bit of yellow to come up into some of these warmer areas. So warmer color temperature wise just feels like it's got a little more yellow possibly into it. So when I see something with more yellow, to me, it feels a little warmer. And I'm exaggerating. I'm not trying to do an exact replica of that photo. I'm exaggerating a little bit. I just want to make sure that I have some lights and some darks. And then I'm going to get even lighter in some of these highlighted areas here in a bit. Right now, I'm going to let some of this stuff dry a little bit. And I'm just going to clean off this brush. And then I'm going to go to the stem. Notice how my paper towel is getting quite dirty. I just fold it over and use a clean spot on it. So I can get quite a bit of use out of that one paper towel. Okay, so now I'm going to go up to my stem. I'm going to use my blue and my brown to create a blackish shade. Figure out where my stem is. And if it looks a little green, that's okay. I don't mind. Once I put in those other browns and such, it'll look a little bit better. But for now, just giving myself the idea of what this stem is going to look like. Getting those darks in, nice and dark. And then I can come in with my brown and my white, maybe even a touch of yellow. And a little tiny bit of red. The red and the yellow make an orange color. So if my stem has got some orange in it, I've got to add that yellow in with it too. And I'm just going to lighten up a couple areas of the stem. Not too light quite yet, but just a little bit. And notice that this highlight of that stem is lighter than that background. So I've got to add even more white and more yellow and red, that orange color. So quite a bit of yellow, a little bit of that red, and some white. And I'm just going to paint it in where I see it. I'm not going to worry about perfection. If you go too big with your stem and you want to make it look smaller, just even take your highlights and highlight that top edge, which will visually make it look a little bit smaller. Worst case scenario, if you get way too big and you really got to hone it in, you can always go into that background color. You'd have to paint your entire background again because otherwise it won't cover. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and simply create some highlights. So to create those highlights, again, I think simply, I'm going to look at the color that I see, and it's a light color, but it's not quite pink. It's got some yellow in it as well, because that's kind of a warm light source I had on there. So I'm going to go to my pink, and I'm going to add some more white and some yellow, and then just go and hold it up and say, okay, it looks something like that. And I'm starting not with the white, but this kind of peachy color. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing and wiggling the color into the brush. See how these brush bristles flare? That really helps load the brush. I'm just going to feather it over that area, barely touching. So I'm not using thick, goopy paint. The paint is really loaded in. In fact, if you're worried about it, you can always wipe it off on your paper towel. This is called a dry brush technique. And you kind of have to wait for everything else to be a little bit dry underneath before you do this. So my whole pair would have to dry. I'm doing this as a video and I'm using, you know, a certain amount of paint here, but in your home, you might have to wait a little bit longer for this step in between. I sped it up a little bit here for you guys. Now I'm going to add more white, and this time I might scoop it up a little bit, and right in the middle of that dry brush highlight, I can add a dot of that light color. Now there is another place where there's some highlight. I'm just going to leave that brush in the water for a minute and go to my highlighted brush. Notice here, there's kind of like a light highlightish area here and here as well. And those are cooler highlights. They're a little different. I call them cooler color temperatures. Don't let that stress you out. This just has a little bit more of a peachy color to it. This has more of a bluish tinge because it's sitting on top of that background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that highlight I had for the warm part of the pear, and I'm just going to add, notice I have some blue here in the edge of my white. I'm just going to take that blue and add it, that bluish white, and add it to my peachy color. I can go in and get more blue if I need to. I just want a lighter color that has a little bit of that blue tinge to it. And this might be too light. Sometimes I have to throw it in there to see. Yeah, that's a little too light. So let's darken it up. Let's take this pinky color and add some blue to it. The great thing about painting with acrylic is that it's opaque. And if the color goes purple, that's okay. I don't mind that. And again, I'm just kind of feathering it on lightly, barely kissing, wiping off the color if needed so that I just get a little trace of that highlight. Now for this highlight up here, I might use a little bit of that white and red. A little more red. I don't want it light, but I'm going to add some brown to that one, that highlight. And I'm going to try that first. And I'm just going to throw it in and see. Again, just barely any paint on that brush. I really pushed and wiggled it in. I'm just kissing the canvas with this color. Again, wipe it off. You can really rub it out of the brush so there's hardly, see how there's hardly anything left? That way I just get a little trace. This dry brushing technique is really helpful when you're painting with acrylics and you can't make something look exact. Okay. I can go back in and darken up that shadow right underneath of my pear if I need it to be a little darker in there. I just slapped down quite a bit of paint. Then I'm just going to go in, and I can either use my finger to kind of blend it in a little bit, or I can use my brush, dry it off really well, and just kind of drag that color a smidge. Just get a nice dark shadow right underneath of that pear. If I need to extend my shadow a bit more, if it started to leave the canvas a little bit in all my excitement here, I can go back in now that that background's dry, and I can add another layer just to darken up that shadow a smidge more. And then the same thing with all the background and everything. If you need to go back in and add another layer of paint, the great thing, like I said, about painting with acrylics is we can layer. So if I need to go back in now and darken up this corner of my background, and then slowly but surely layer over top of that background so that I get that nice kind of orangey brown color moving all the way over to my pear and covering up some areas where maybe I went too big with that stem, or I didn't like my shape on my pear. Now that I'm starting to go in to this background, I'm lightening it up a little bit, I can paint right back over the existing background. Now, as I said before, once you do this, you might have to then go in and cover up all of the existing background. Otherwise, it might not be, you might not mix exactly the same color. It's almost impossible with acrylic to mix exactly the same color as one that's dried. You can try, and you know, I've tried, but the problem is that you get something called color shift with acrylic paint. That means that when the paint dries, it dries darker than when it's wet. So when it's dry and I'm trying to mix a wet paint to match, it's hard to match it. So I just will then paint over that whole area again. And I'm just going to darken up this corner. I'm not worried about perfection here. If my background is a little bit messy, well, that's okay. I want my focal point, the area that the eye goes to be this pear anyway. So I'm going to put away the idea of perfection. That's really hard for most of us, right? Just try and put away that stress of being perfect. Art is a place where just try new things. It's in those failures that you really learn the most. At least I find that to be true. So I just go in and I can just adjust my color, my value here and there. This just gives you an idea of how the demo would go for my workshops. And then, like I said, after I'm done with this, I'd stop this demo and I'd actually just turn it to you, asking each of you to send me an email with a work in progress. So take a picture on your phone of your work in progress. You'll email it to me during the class. I'll be able to share it on the screen, the Zoom screen, and then I'll use my computer to point out areas that I think could be adjusted.